1, 2, 3, swing it.
Do you have an old sound tape or your favorite cassette tape that you want converted to CD or MP3 format? Do you need a demo CD, radio ad, a DJ or even a sound system for your wedding, birthday or special occasion? Then why not get in contact with KTR Records at 07931 152 448 or check out our website on www.ktrrecords.com. We have been in business since 2004 and also undertake community projects. So for your remixes, doublets and all your sound editing needs, why not contact KTR Records, official sponsor of World Jam Global Radio. KTR Records, coming your way!
I was terrified about sharing the vulnerabilities of people with difficulties reading and spelling words. However, I could see the value in sharing, and I have taken the time to make some notes about this in my book, Dyslexic: The Silent Difference. You can get your copy now at www.a1tribe.com or amazon.com or amazon.co.uk. Thank you again everyone for your support.
Do you like music like this?
Great music all the time.
Or like this?
The music you love.
Maybe this.
Great music that makes you want to turn up the volume loud.
Or life check like this.
Especially where human life is concerned. Surely, sooner or later, people will realize that lives actually matter.
Then you're in the right place. Keep it locked to World Jam Global, where music is harmony.
Music 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
Yeah, you're a World Jam. Hotter than them.
See live schedule.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
Stand by for another explosive show. My name is Kervin Julian. It's Issues Today live on World Jam Global Radio.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
Back from a 2-week break.
Did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
And right now I am sharing this live stream right across the world.
Didn't really care about the system. It was all about survival. It was do or die. I had too many rivals. I was too young and foolish to stay in school. I learned my lessons in the streets. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do. That's why I'm telling my story to you and you. I had to repent. I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chump. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common. I was the real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd chew you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters.
The opening statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison.
Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time.
I didn't realize I had so many places to post this program to. Good gosh.
Already did my time. Pay for my crime, pay for my crime, pay for my crime, pay for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. this felony off my back so I can get my life on track and have the right to vote and live like an ordinary citizen again. This is my message to
Now we're back after a short break and we return with another roundtable.
worldwide.
Our guest speakers this week are
Not a
former Chief of Police and author Jerry Summers,
Handsome.
exoneree and wrongfully convicted Mark Clements,
Women.
sister of Andre Gladden, D. Martin,
Kid.
uncle and victim of advocate Patrick Lane,
Things have
and
changed.
father of killed by cops victim and advocate
Changed.
Mr. Scott Russian, alongside TJ Teresa Gallagher.
Ain't about being no gangster like
Therese, that is. That's my co-producer.
trying to cope with
With the backlash of the Central Park 5 making waves globally on the news, the Netflix drama has thrown up a new perspective. The powerful direction and performances brought the reality of the pain and devastation caused by these manipulated lies of corruption to a worldwide audience
From a
who are just beginning to get an understanding of what we discuss on this show every week and what many have suffered for decades. We must use this opportunity to break the stranglehold the corrupt judicial system has demonstrated and move for change that will never permit these atrocities to take place again. My qualified guests, all with personal experience, will take us through some ideas for positive change.
when you
Stand by.
repent. I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest
I want
Gump.
to say thank you for all of you who are joining me. Lorraine Thompson, Rosemary Dunez, Vanessa Whirling.
Than Arnold Schwarzenegger, I'd chew you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters.
Sammy Timmins, Audrey Thomas, Jazia White, Ronnie Canada.
My time.
By the way, Ronnie Canada is singing on this track that you're hearing right now. Our dear friend, former member of Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes and original Blue Notes,
Could be facing
and Kip Tassin Monassi. Among others, tuning in live right here on World Jam Global.
Trying to cope with this living hell. Trying to cope with this living hell.
Use these opening moments, my dear friends, to share this stream with any groups or associations that you're involved with.
Trying to cope.
We just got to get this out live all over the world. My guests will be joining us in just a very few short moments. Stand by for a very exhilarating discussion.
Time. I paid
The fight for change.
Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Paper my crown, paper my crown, paper my crown, paper my crown, paper my crown. All those drive-by killings stop
Vocals by my dear friend, Mr. Ronnie Canada.
nothing.
Over 30 years.
He who was out sin.
Very close friend and associate. Thank you, sir.
Stop.
Exclusive.
I'm trying to get this felony off my back so I can get my life on track and have the right
My
to
theme song that I open my show with.
sin again. This is my message to all
Provided by my dear friend.
statewide, worldwide, and put down those knives. Stop stabbing each other. Yeah.
Bit, so I'm not sure.
Okay, guys, we are now live on Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio, along with my guests, Scott Russian, Jerry Summers, D. Martin, Patrick Lane, Therese, who is my co-producer, Mark Clements, I'm hoping is going to join us very shortly. So, yeah, stand by, and let me first introduce you to my co-producer, Therese, who's going to tell us all what's going to be going on today and the order of play. How are we doing, Therese?
Really, really good, boss. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. I'm great.
Okay. I'd like to first thank our panel for coming and being a part of this. I You have a wonderful panel, and I believe it was Scott Rushing that identified us as the think tank. So there's going to be a lot of coming together on that. We were going to talk about, I want to talk about qualified immunity and how qualified immunity, I think we all have maybe a different perception of what qualified immunity is. I'm not quite sure what law it falls under, but Scott Rushing brought us into this qualified immunity. And then Herb and Julie and our host, he challenged each of us to tell what we thought qualified immunity was. And I personally believe, because Attorney General told me that, maybe I can't sue the federal government per se, but I can sue individual federal employees, and that's the Bivens action. And for qualified immunity, it's not a defense for federal personnel because the Bivens action provides the cause. And the cause of action, not against the government per se, but against those that are serving in individual capacities as a federal employee, violating someone else's Fourth Amendment rights. Now, that's just my idea of what it is, and maybe we'll get to a conclusion on just exactly what it is. There's probably a lot of loopholes in that, like obviously our laws are. So I'd like to start out that way, and then I'd like to go into how we do it. How do we make this change? The advocates that go out there and beat the road, they walk their talk. Yolanda, D. Martin, Patrick Lane, Jerry Summers, if he was, in the situation that he would have to defend us, so to speak, and Scott Rushing on this show. Yolanda's not with us today, but she'll be missed. However, she's in Ohio, and she just got back from Portland, as well as D. Martin did. And I want them to elaborate on just how difficult it is, but joining and uniting together is essential. And how do we do that? And so that's pretty much, and then the boss will take over. Is that okay with everyone?
Sure. Sounds great.
Okay, well.
Okay, Scott?
Well, I've been thinking about this question since we talked, and the overarching idea that I have is it's pretty clear that we all who have different opinions, and we all have different interpretations of what qualified immunity means. That's the clear message.
Right.
So if you can imagine all of us who've been watching and studying and involved with, let's say, police-related issues and qualified immunity, and look how kind of we each have a different take on it based on our own perspective. Lost loved one, law enforcement officer, like Kervin coordinating this, what I call think tank or roundtable. I mean, there is no wrong or right, and we're all just sort of interpreting. And in my case, the district attorney used the phrase, again, these are police officers' actions. And qualified immunity, also, I've learned that it covers really all government employees, not necessarily police officers. It could be some other whistleblower or in some other agency. But in our case, it's police-related issues, in my case. And the district attorney used the qualified immunity law to justify the killing of Tyler, my son, because he used the phrase about a reasonable officer would have known that the officer's conduct was lawful or not when he shot or tased Tyler Rushing. And he determined, the DA, who's an attorney, that a reasonable officer would have felt that the officer's actions were reasonable, and therefore he determined it was not unreasonable for the officers to shoot, kill, tase Tyler Rushing, therefore killing justified. So the DA used this great word that I hate, the weasel word reasonable, to grate power to, in effect, exonerate and justify the officers who killed my son. And you see the word reasonable pop up again and again in police issue. It's just so subject to interpretation that it allows too much leeway, in my opinion. And so that's where I was coming from. That in the case of qualified immunity for the officers that shot my son, the DA determined their conduct was lawful, that it was not unreasonable. And other words, like they were in fear of their lives, and they were in fear of the lives of their fellow officers. You've all heard those comments before. But the underlying justification for killing Ty and not filing charges was that the officers acted reasonably, which is part of the law of qualified immunity for police officers.
Wow. How does that resonate with the rest of you guys? Anybody else want to come in on this?
I'll jump in. Scott's right. I remember with the reading of Taylor's synopsis of the police report 4 months after his killing. The synopsis was fraught with words like reasonably and clearly. And now this is a police officer, and I would even say that Scott's situation is like this. These are police officers that really, in many cases, violated protocol, violated the policies of their departments. Yet they were cleared, and they were cleared, as Scott said, with language like reasonably and certainly, and these types of terms that go on to paint our loved ones in a certain light, and it also casts those officers also in a different type of light. So I absolutely get what Scott's saying.
Okay, well, listen.
Been through it.
Let me, because I know TJ wanted to get a better understanding of what qualified immunity was, and we want to talk about how that's been used against getting decent prosecution against law enforcement officers whom it is believed were really in I'm going to reserve, I'm going to take the fifth on what the comments I'm about to make, but let me just go back to the qualified immunity law and legal definition. All right? Now listen, you guys need to really listen and get this, because this is qualified immunity in its legal definition. Qualified immunity protects public officials from being sued for damages unless they violated clearly established law of which a reasonable official in his position would have known. Now let me just stop there, and I'm gonna break that down for you. What that's actually saying is the person responsible, right? The person that you're looking to sue, it has to be clear, right? Clearly established that he would have known he was in violation. All right? It aims to protect civil servants from the fear of litigation in performing discretionary functions entrusted to them by law. The qualified immunity test requires a two-part analysis. The first part, was the law governing the official's conduct clearly established? In other words, whatever it is that governs that law enforcement officer from carrying out the action that he carried out, was it clearly established? Under that law, could a reasonable officer, remember this, under that law, no other form of common sense, under that law, could a reasonable officer have believed the conduct was lawful? In other words, what we're now saying is, if the person himself believed his conduct was lawful, he's already protected. In other words, he's just got to say, I believe I was doing the right thing, according to the law as I know it. Now, if I'm wrong, let's bring in Jerry Summers here, former chief of police at Idaho, and a very dear friend to the show and people who are looking for reform. Have I just explained qualified immunity?
Yes, but you weren't. I don't believe you were clear. You were quite correct in your breakdown of the definition. Now, first of all, I want to say qualified immunity is a very, very, very broad statute that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. The key elements to qualified immunity is that the officer or the government official, their conduct does not violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights, which a reasonable person would have known. So, in other words, we have a reasonable right against proper search and seizure. I can't, as I walked up and say, I understand you're involved in some activity that is illegal. I'm going to go search your home. I can't kick your door in and search it. If I did so, I would violate clearly established rights and constitutional rights that you have and statutory rights that you also have. It also doesn't protect the plainly incompetent or those who knowingly violate the law. Now, that's a broad statute. I mean, plainly incompetent is a lot easier to prove than somebody knowingly violating the law. Intent is always much harder to improve than the fact that you're just incompetent. I mean, what you did was inappropriate. It was incompetent. You knew or should have known that it was in violation of law. That being said, when you go to the reasonable officer standard, the problem is if you have officers reviewing other officers' behavior in a culture where the thin blue line or the blue wall of silence reigns supreme, and any officer who may want to speak out against the officer's actions chooses not to because the culture will destroy them if they do.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
Wow.
That's a tough take, right?
It's an accurate one.
It's very accurate. So again, it opens up another question. If the officer has to be in knowledge of what the guidelines, what the law is, what the legislation is, what the rights are of an individual, in order for him to qualify for qualified immunity, then should he not have access to that knowledge, training, and information before he's being given a lethal weapon that is likely to take away someone's life?
That's my question.
And one would argue they have, because there's the portion in the law, as much as reasonable works in behalf of the government official, knew or should have known works against them. So
right.
If my action, for instance, there's a case that I'm involved in, and I'm not going to talk about it, but in essence, the officer had a taser and a handgun out at the same time. Clearly a violation of their policies and procedures. You do not have both because it's easy to pull the wrong trick. They knew or should have known that they get claiming qualified immunity in the shooting, and that officer has now been promoted back where they're going to be the department's taser.
Irvin, we're getting some background noise. I'm sorry to report.
Yeah, unfortunately, my daughter has had a whole posse of friends come and join her, and they've because my studio's in the garage at the back of the house, and they've come in through the side door, and they've come in screaming. I'm just trying to access my phone to send her a message because I've reminded her already the noise.
Quiet time, yeah.
So, go ahead.
The rub here, as I see it, is that, and a lot of what law enforcement is going through right now with regard to advocacies against them, and even the thing you posted, hands up, don't shoot, where if an officer shoots an unarmed person, he should automatically get 15 years. I've got some feelings about that I'll address later. The premise is correct. The actual outcome and what they're is incorrect because there's a thing called due process, and that due process goes to everybody, the criminal and the officer alike. I don't want to be here defending police officers because I'm a very strong-spoken individual that they have created their own self-inflicted wound by not themselves for over 50 years, and they're refusing to police themselves. And now there's a groundswell that's coming, and rightfully so, because the flip side, though, there's some very good law enforcement officers that are very honest out there, and the culture prevents them from and being so. And that's not an excuse. It's the fact that you still need to do the right thing, but if your career is going to be destroyed and your life is going to be destroyed, much like a victim's family is destroyed by the government, one really hesitates in speaking out. It takes a very strong person to speak out against a culture that they know is going to destroy them.
A lot of fear of not wanting to speak out too. And can we expect kids that are 19, 18 years old, right out of high school, becoming a police officer and being able to deal with mental illness or excitable delirium or, there's got to be an absolute training, like you were saying, Jerry. There's got to be training, and you train a lot of years to become an attorney. You train a lot of years. You just can't go into that capacity and that position. Instability, if anything.
Just 1 second, TJ. You're going to have to message Mark and tell him he's got to get quiet. All of that noise in the background is coming through again. Mark has just come back on. And we've got a lot of noise in the background. I don't want to mute him again because he's probably going to have something important to say. But he's got to get himself somewhere quiet. We can't have this.
I have alerted him.
Yeah, but he's reconnected. I've brought him back on again, and now we've actually got this background noise which we need to find a way to manage. Okay, so. When we're talking about this qualified immunity, right? This qualified immunity is having. I'm really going to have to mute him. But once I mute him, I can't unmute him, and he can't unmute himself. The only thing that I can do is take him off the call and call him back in again. Can you message him and tell him that he needs to find himself somewhere quiet?
I have.
Okay.
I have.
All right. Okay. Let me just carry on for a second, and hopefully he's going to come online and realize that the noise is really intruding. But this qualified immunity really leaves open, unclosed questions. It doesn't make sense in its format because, Scott Russian makes several references to the use of this word reasonable. What is reasonable? What do we consider to be reasonable? Is it not reasonable for a police officer to know that somebody who with their hands up, who is not carrying a lethal weapon and not in pursuit of criminal activity, is not a danger to himself? Is that not a reasonable request or a reasonable assumption?
Or someone walking away or running away.
All of the above. Would that not be considered to be reasonable?
Go on and on.
So what is this reasonable thing? And I think that's what we need to open up this reasonable. There's two phrases in here that really stand out to me. A is reasonable, and B, clearly established. What do they mean by clearly established? Jerry.
What they clearly established is law. There are things where officers take action where there's not a clearly established law, and it gets litigated, and it either establishes clearly established law or does it violation. It's broad enough to protect in those circumstances. I'm trying to think of it and can't right off the top of my head.
Jerry, I can give you an example. Maybe you can think of it while you're. What about someone who's driving away from a traffic stop? It's my impression that the officers are not supposed to shoot into a vehicle that's leaving the scene, that they're not supposed to shoot into that vehicle. And yet that occurs all the time. here in Southern California. And
Let me-
so that example is it reasonable for an officer to shoot a fleeing vehicle or someone, driving away from a traffic stop?
Well, the question is, the answer is no, it is not reasonable. However, there are circumstances I want to address. But there was a case in Texas where shot a car leaving, killed a young man, and was convicted of manslaughter, voluntary.
Well, I can't hear anything. I'm sorry, guys.
Yeah,
Getting too much noise.
yeah. So there's somebody driving, or there's somebody in a position where there's vehicle driving past them. There's still a lot of noise in the background. We're going to have to do something about this noise. If I have to go through each guest muting the mic until I can establish where the noise is, I'll eliminate it. But if it's you and you're aware that it's you, if you can mute your mic in between the conversations and just be tuned in so that you can come back in when you're ready, that will suffice. But to have the noise constantly coming through the show, it's really going to be a real massive interruption and unfair on the sincerity and the importance and significance of what we're trying to discuss here. Let me just nip in very quickly to open this up just a little bit more, to give you a bit more to play with. Because in this first part where it talks about clearly established, it says, qualified immunity protects public officials from being sued for damages unless they violated clearly established law of which a reasonable official in his or her position would have known. So now what they're trying to say is the official would have needed to have known that they were in breach of that law or that violation in order for them to disqualify themselves from qualified immunity. Does that make sense?
It does, Turvin. Let me finish where I was going with Scott, because he asked a question that's important, and it's important that people understand what occurred. The right to flee, to shoot a felon, it used to be a fleeing felon, was a standard that you could do that. That has changed, and now it's somebody who's fleeing a scene that is more likely than not to harm either the general public or themselves. That's a broad statute, but I cannot, Scott, if you were in a car and I made a traffic stop on you and you looked at me and said, you're an idiot, and drove away, and that was it, okay, I can't shoot you under those circumstances. Now, if there's an officer standing in front of your car and you drive away and you bounce that officer, male or female, off the hood of the car and you're driving away, all of a sudden now you're a threat to the general public and or other people. Is that grounds to fire into a fleeing vehicle at that point? My response would be no, it is not. However, there have been legal cases where it said it was. And that's where our problem is. The reasonable standard is not only a reasonable standard of the officer or another official, but this is where the prosecutors and the judges are supposed to be evaluating that as well. And don't forget, you have qualified immunity for government officials. You have absolute immunity for prosecutors. So the prosecutor can absolutely lie in the circumstance of the case and not be held accountable knowingly that they're lying, because they have absolute immunity. And that is worse than qualified immunity. So what you've got is a dual situation where the culture covers for one another, and now you've got a situation where there's corruption not only at the police level or the government official level, but also in the courts level. Because the courts, the same culture that's affecting a good officer from speaking out is the same culture that's affecting a good prosecutor from speaking out. And prosecutors are supposed to be evaluating the actions of police and determining if they're reasonable or not prior to bringing a charge. Unfortunately, the way prosecutors get promoted is convictions.
Okay.
Sure.
So here's the thing. Lorraine Thompson asked this. She says, Mr. Kervin, wouldn't you think if an officer killed an innocent person thinking it was lawful, maybe they did feel at the time possible danger, but later it's clear that there was no true danger? Why lie? Why then fabricate evidence to suggest that what they thought was lawful and legal was actually correct? Now, when I say that, let's go to Andre Gladden, shall we? Because this was a man that was registered blind, who'd been to a hospital, who was looking for help, and the officers were unaware he was registered blind, so tried to claim that he was trying to attack them with a knife. He fell, dropped the knife, and then tried to pick up the knife again to attack them again. He clearly couldn't have done any of that because he was blind. So, in that respect, it is clear that at the time, whatever the officer might have felt or thought, and it's understandable without knowing he was registered blind, but the fact that they fabricated the entire incident, to make it look like Andre Gladden was a perpetrator or a violent or aggressive individual, right? The fact that they've now been found out because he was registered blind and he couldn't have done any of those things, should that not have removed the qualified immunity process from that officer and made him available for prosecution?
Absolutely, it should have, and it should have removed the qualified immunity for anybody who deemed it was okay.
Yeah, I agree.
So let's bring in D, shall we? D, because D Martin is Andre Gladden's sister, who's advocated for him, and a welcome member to our new our Roundtable team, and I'm really looking forward to what she's actually going to be contributing. So when you hear about this qualified immunity that would have protected the officer who fabricated the evidence that led to him getting away with what he did to your brother, how does that leave you feeling?
Awful, speechless. In fact, I don't. The qualified immunity thing, I don't understand. There's the blanket. If these officers are acting in accordance with the law, the immunity gives them too much leeway to play ignorant to these laws to have to need qualified immunity. If we're doing what we're doing, if their job is to protect and to serve the community, the other officers on the field, what is the need for it? We all need to be held accountable for our actions. There shouldn't be this huge protection or shield that they hide behind. Just as you said before,
yeah, go on,
if these, what was that? I'm sorry.
No, so I said carry on.
So I just don't understand why there has to be a need for this qualified immunity if you're operating an ordinance of the law. There's too much room for human error. This gives them a right to make these errors. However, these errors are causing lives. These mistakes are lives. There's no reset button because you assumed this was a certain object, or you assumed a certain situation was going to happen later to find out, it wasn't anything like you thought. So I don't understand why the qualified immunity. If we commit a crime, we're jailed for it. The same thing needs to go for these officers. The ignorance of them being able to claim qualified immunity is unbelievable for me. The instance with my brother, as he stated on those 911 calls, I understand that he had limited knowledge of whether he had usable eyesight, but he was a parent. It was made aware to him that there was a disability there. The officer stated in the grand jury that he saw that Andre was without his right eye, and based on the phone calls, let the officer know that this was an issue with this particular individual. So a lot of the things that occurred, nowhere near reasonable. I don't understand how it was reasonable or deemed as reasonable to justify that. So it makes me upset. It completely draws the line.
I want to try and see if I can bring in Mark Clements if I can. He's really been hovering in the wings for a while. You're going to need to unmute your mic, Mark, if you're able to get in there. We're talking about qualified immunity at the minute, and what I'd like you to do first and foremost, Mark, is just give them a little bit of a soundbite of your experience, what you went through, and then we'll get into how qualified immunity affected you with your case.
Okay, can you hear me loud?
Clearly, Mark. Absolutely. Clearly.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I am a Chicago police torture survivor. Back in 1981, I was taken to a police station and I was tortured to confess to a crime that I did not commit. Unfortunately, I served 28 years of my life inside of a prison before winning my release in 2009. Unfortunately, and listening to the situations that have occurred, they are all awful situations. However, the police have worked in the style of guerrilla warfare and in the style of basically legally lynching us as a people. And there's no solution due to the fact that, in my opinion, most people, man, they allow the system to get away with this stuff. And it's all structured around unity. No unity, you can never bring closure to these awful situations as to what the police do to people. I've wrote a book, Tortured by Blue, and I urge people to at least purchase a copy of that book. Matter of fact, you can go right on your Google Books and purchase it as low as $3.99, and to learn of the history as to what John Burge did to so many people in the city of Chicago. I'm talking about in upward numbers of 200 to 300 people were taken down to police stations, having their genitals and testicles grabbed and squeezed, and confessing to crimes that they did not commit. The city of Chicago is faced with a awful situation, near bankruptcy, and trying to pay out settlements, dealing with this scandalous police officer, John Burge, in the city of Chicago. So, it's awful what these police officers are allowed to get away with.
Mark?
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, let me back quicker. Is
Yes.
Burge is still alive and well and on a pension living in Florida, isn't he? Am I correct?
No. Burge is dead and no longer receiving his pension because he's dead. He died in September of last year from cancer.
All right.
And is that Alex?
No.
That's Scott Russian. We haven't had Alex on for a little while, but yes, I remember we did a show with Alex, didn't we, Mark?
Yes.
Okay.
He has a voice similar to Alex.
He does.
Okay.
So, Mark, just tell me, how did you manage to win your freedom in the end?
Well, I won my freedom due to the fact that it was learned that the real perpetrators had sold individuals some B12 protein powder for cocaine, and that they had set this apartment building afire, killing 4 people. Basically winning my freedom due to the fact that a resident of the community come forward after so long. And, man, that's the cases here, meaning the people have been silenced by the criminal court system, and it takes so long to dig these people out wherever they may be and hope that they come forward. But no, an individual come forward clearing me of the charge.
Wow. Jimmy Dennis was another one that served 28 years in prison for something that he didn't commit.
Pennsylvania.
That's correct.
Yes, Pennsylvania.
And I had Jimmy on this show, I think it was last year or the year before, in very similar circumstances. So what do you do in Chicago now?
Well, I work for the Chicago Torture Justice Center. This is a center that was won by individuals that were tortured as the result of John Burge. So basically, what I'm doing with the Chicago Torture Justice Center is working on policy to reform of the Chicago Police Department. It has been a very complicated and long, exhausting process, but it has to be done. So that's what I'm doing. I work for the Chicago Torture Justice Center.
Amen. So, again, was there any prosecutions from any of the officers or anybody that was involved in?
No, that none of the officers involved were prosecuted. Not a one, and it was over 30 plus additional officers other than Burge that engaged into this criminal activity, and all of them have grew fat off of the hog and has either died or living off of their pensions and living very comfortable lives, while most of the victims of John Burge is penniless now today.
Whoa. I want to bring in Patrick Lane if I can. Another dear friend and a regularly attendee on the Roundtable crew team. If you're listening, Patrick, you need to unmute your mic and bring yourself in. He might be otherwise occupied, so let's just go back to Jerry Summers. Oh no, here's Patrick now. Come in, Patrick.
Yeah, the Mark, I believe his name was. That's fascinating, disturbing on so many levels. All these stories are so disturbing. For me, it seems like, when we're talking about qualified immunity and we're talking about all these components to the legality of these types of things, it seems like, to me, it's evidence of a system that is actually working as it's designed to work. And that's to protect government officials, protect officers. And I would say that it's working very well as it was designed to work. That's my take on it, Kirby.
Funny thing is, the number one on the list from TJ, and Mark mentioned it at the very beginning in his opening statement, and the words he used was unity. And so therefore we've got groups of people, pockets of different groups of people and organizations right across the states of the United States of America, all fighting little battles, which are huge for them individually, but the impact is minimal because of the separation, isolation and individualism that each of these groups and organizations have. And Mark mentioned it right there at the beginning. We are not a united people. We are, and when I say we are not a united people, I'm not talking about race or creed or color. I'm talking about victims of police brutality and corruption. I'm talking about people that have to live in the world. I'm talking about people that have to answer to authority and live by certain rules and regulations. As a people, we are separated, segregated, and we are prone and dictated to by propaganda, which is one of the major things that governments and institutionalized organizations use to capitalize and keep us separated and apart from each other, right? But until we get the essence of what unity is and the importance of what we can accomplish if we were to join forces and battle this thing together, we're not going to get very far, are we? And I want to throw that one out to D. Martin right now. Hi, D.
Hey, I'm here.
Okay, come on, sister, preach.
So, unity, it's a huge thing. It's a huge thing for everyone. I come across protesting Sacramento. I'm going out to Portland, Oregon. A lot of people are oblivious to what's going on. There's a few situations as to me speaking with individuals on the street, and they're completely oblivious to what's going on, and their reactions are like, oh my God, or I can't believe this, but this is police. They're used to the, I've never had a complete favor for police. That's just me, based on my upbringing and what I saw. So they're oblivious to what's going on. A lot of them are afraid of the penalties of when we unite, what could happen, how they can be targeted, the importance of the unity, and how we can work together to create a solution. And I let them know that you've been lied to. You've been lied to. Your vote counts. What you say means something. It brings motivation to the next family, supporting the next family, going through it. If this has not happened to you directly, there's no guarantee for me or anybody who stands in front or behind me that this will not happen to your loved one. In respect of the families that do go through, we ask that you stand and support them. However, they're afraid of what will happen. It's not, the conversation is not welcomed, obviously. In many churches, it's not welcomed in the workplace. If you speak in offense to any sort of police brutality, and this is just direct from my workplace, I'm pushed aside. They don't want to hear it. They don't have time for it. This is not something that they've gone through, so they don't see the importance. But the importance is we value our loved ones, and we want to see them make it home just as well as we want the good officers, or the officers that are in the field. We want to all be able to live peacefully together. Until we can understand that there is, a bad taste, a bad influence that roams this place, then nobody is safe. But we need to bring the attention to the communities and throughout that this is happening. How do we unite as one? How do we put bills in place or things in place to make sure that we can ensure the lives of our children and of our future? Because if the green, like I said a while ago, the green light has been given to do what's being done, as he said, it's working fabulously. They're doing exactly what they were called to do. There's no de-escalation. We know that. At any given time, I keep hearing the words when I speak to different, individuals. Well, just comply and don't give them a reason. Comply and don't give them a reason. Well, Moose Hayes complied to his death. Yeah. He complied to his death.
Yeah.
And still he didn't make it home. These police officers are not giving these victims an opportunity to stand before the court and plead their case. However, they're instantly sentenced to the grave.
Do you know,
they're for law enforcement to carry all these weapons? How are they afraid when you're the one obviously with the weapon? And hundreds of these victims are without weapons.
I think
they're planted.
I remember and I recall Little Vic, having Victor White on this show back last year, and the story of Little Vic, which was documented in another drama or documentary called Sugar Town, and remembering that Little Vic was not the suspect that the police had actually come to visit. There was a fight taking place at a store, if I remember correctly. And by the time the police arrived, the guys that were actually involved in the fight had already fled and gone. Little Vic was there still. And they've searched him and found a very small proportion of marijuana or something in his pocket. They've arrested him. They've handcuffed him. They've searched him 3 times. They've put him in the back of a police vehicle. And then he goes missing for 3 hours. Doesn't turn up anywhere for 3 hours on some kind of ghost ride with police officers wherever they took him. But for 3 hours, he didn't show up. When he does eventually show up, he's dead. Having been searched 3 times, they claim that while in the back of a police vehicle, with his hands handcuffed behind his back, he pulls a gun out of his waist and shoots himself in the chest. Hands behind his back, handcuffed, but shoots himself in the chest. Houdini couldn't have managed that. And yet, even with what appears to be, and this word reasonable again comes into play, because surely the description, the explanation, the evidence that was provided in order to try and justify qualified immunity for these law enforcement officers that were involved in the killing, execution, death of Little Vic, surely everybody involved in that would have been aware that what they were suggesting took place was not reasonable, could not have been accepted as reasonable. Now, I don't know who wants to come in here, but that's where I'm at the minute. I'd like you to come in if you can, Jerry, and enlighten us just a little bit more, please.
Urban, you're right that everything you just laid out was not reasonable. And there's no way to come to that conclusion from a reasonable officer, reasonable government official standard that it was reasonable. And that's where the court systems have failed. I mean, you've got a culture of corruption in a police department. Chicago is one, Baltimore is another. There are several cultures of corruption throughout law enforcement. There is no doubt, nobody's disputing that. We know we have a corrupt culture. The courts are supposed to be addressing some of that corrupt culture. Unfortunately, they're not doing their job either. There's a three-part system. I mean, you have the suspect in the police, you have the defense attorneys, and you have the prosecutors that are supposed to be looking at whether these things are reasonable or not. I can tell you in the community I worked in, my prosecutor would have never allowed something like that to come around. If somebody were gone for 3 hours, there would have been criminal charges filed. But that's not every circumstance either. And I'm not trying to excuse police behavior, because there's police behavior in Chicago, Baltimore, the ones that you see the most of right now, where you see people on dash cams or body cams finding evidence on individuals. You know that there's in Mark's situation, there was a torture community that went on with the police department, and people in that community, the police and the prosecutors, knew about it and did absolutely nothing about it. And until there's transparency and reasonable self-policing, this corruption has been allowed to go on for almost 50 years now in law enforcement. And the court systems are not holding law enforcement officials, and the judges aren't holding prosecutors accountable, and it's just been allowed to have a huge crisis.
So I'm glad you said that, Jerry, because it raises a very important question. You see, it's right that we should be angry at law enforcement. It's right that we should be angry at the police. It's right that we need to look at their involvement, their collaborations, their manipulation, their corruption, their lies. It's right that we should investigate just how bad they are and what they do. But it's also right that we look at what within the system allows them to get away with it. And that's where the next level comes in, because it's the district attorneys and the prosecutors that determine whether or not these officers have committed any crimes that are unlawful, that are worthy of prosecuting in the state's name.
Well, Kervin, let me jump in here. Just use your example. There is no way a reasonable prosecutor or defense attorney could excuse the actions of the police officers. When a guy goes missing for 3 hours, nobody knows where he is. He's handcuffed, and then he shoots himself in the chest. Even an attorney that has absolutely no criminal crime scene reconstruction background has to question those circumstances, and it didn't happen.
Yeah, and that's the important thing. Once the evidence submitted, and I suppose we're almost getting to that time where the second phase of the show, where I wanted to come in, and I think it's absolutely perfect, because when you look at going back to When They See Us, and those of you that watch the drama, those of you that are aware of the Central Park 5 case scenario, consequences, and outcome. When the evidence was clear that these officers who were being told to get a confession no matter what, when they were being challenged by the prosecutor, right, that this doesn't just doesn't stand up, and I can't say for certain whether the statements that were made in the program were as genuine and real as what took place in the reality, but I would have imagined that it went somewhere along those lines, because somebody must have looked at that and thought, this actually just doesn't make sense, right? So, yet you had the district attorney who was trying to convince the prosecutor, we're going to go with this and make it fit no matter what. Now let me just quantify this in a sense. You've often heard me mention the Cardiff 5 case, which was the case that I was involved in here in the UK back in 1988, and these two cases are so similar. The Cardiff 5, the Central Park 5, it wasn't just the number 5 that was relevant. A systematic, and the book that was written on behalf of Cardiff 5 was a book called Fitted In. And the fitted in term was meant because the guys were actually fitted into the crime. There was absolutely no evidence to suggest that any of them were actually on the premises, anywhere near the premises, involved in the crime. They had semen, they had blood, they had saliva, they had fingerprints, they had all of these things present at the scene of the crime, which didn't fit any of the guys that they had in the dock, but they still got found guilty. They still pursued a prosecution case and justified it as the most expensive trial in British history to date. Right? The payout for the Central Park 5 was quite similarly one of the highest payouts in the history of the United States. I don't know what the figures are now, but then it was. But looking at the sheer fabrication that was presented as evidence to charge and then convict and sentence the Central Park 5, who should be held most accountable, Jerry?
Well, first and foremost, the officers that are involved in fabricating the evidence should be held accountable. The problem we have is if I think let me back up. If you only hold the officers and not the mental agency they work for accountable, the victims have a huge component of some type of institution going away, because if the officers are not independently wealthy in and of themselves, there's no pocket to go to, and there's no way to resolve that. I mean, you get a judgment, you can't do anything about it. So first of all, that's the first thing. The second thing is that the prosecutors that were involved in this knew or should have known information wasn't jiving, and they still went forward with it. In my opinion, in circumstances like the Central Park 5 as well as the 5 UK, not only the officers should be held criminally liable, so should the barristers or the prosecutors in circumstances. And I would also to the point that and didn't. So, I mean, I would go from the judge all the way to the lowly officer on the street. All of them should have been held criminally responsible for a travesty of this type.
Total scandal, Jerry. Total scandal. Top to bottom.
Absolutely. But can I just interject a minute? And I'm not being sympathetic, and I'm not being soft, but when I watched that program, right, when I watched the dramatization, and the officers are all sat down in that room as they discuss the victim, because let's never forget that there was a victim, and even in the Cardiff 5, we made sure that everybody understood that there was a victim, and that victim was paid the ultimate price. She died. In this particular case in Central Park 5, the woman was raped and almost left for dead, and suffered immeasurable trauma and injuries. So the officers were referring to a victim, but it sounded to me as if everything the officers were being directed to investigate was being dictated by the district attorney, who was in there saying, these guys are responsible. Let's find them. Let's find every single one of them. Now, I just want Jerry to look at this for a minute, because as a former chief of police, you've got an incident in your area, or whatever it might be, a theft, a robbery, a death, a murder, a rape, or whatever it is, and your officers have now got to investigate. The first thing that you've got to pay attention to is the evidence that is available to you at the scene of the crime. Am I correct?
You're correct.
Okay, so if the evidence at the scene of the crime does not suggest a multiple of suspects, why are we looking at 100 or 200 or 300 men that was running through a park to try and whittle them down to a comfortable number that we can charge? Because the police never said that they want to do that. The district attorney said that she did.
For the investigation. The prosecutor is responsible for the prosecution of it. Now, they work hand in hand, but the end result is if the evidence doesn't show that, it doesn't show it. The problem is we have officers that out there that come up with a hypothesis or a theory of what happened, and they make the evidence fit their theory. Unfortunately, the evidence never does, and if you don't have a prosecutor that's questioning that just accepts it, and defense attorneys don't get the information they need because it's hidden by the prosecutor, then you're going to have a travesty. You're going to have a person prosecuted. Not only is the victim's family going to suffer, but the family and the individuals that are wrongfully accused are going to suffer tremendously as well. So now you not only have one victim, you have multiple victims. Because a criminal charge, whether you're guilty or not, sticks with you, and it destroys your reputation. I have a very good friend of mine who's a former chief of police who was accused of stealing a handgun from his department, which is not the case, and we can't get things to just limit the probable cause hearing. There have been motions and motions. He can't get a job. He's gone through all his money and family resources, and he's damn near destroyed. And this happens over and over again. Now, take a family that doesn't have that kind of knowledge of the system and doesn't have those kinds of friends that are willing to help them. They can't defend themselves. The cost is overwhelming.
Yeah, immeasurable.
Insurmountable is the word. Yes.
Social economic situations where the individual that's accused eventually just says, I'll plead guilty to some crime or the crime in order to stop the hemorrhage for my family.
Do you know, I just wanted to see if I can bring Mark Clements in very quickly. Mark Clements, are you there? Are you available to come on? And I know you've got your video on, but can you speak right now?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay,
yes,
so I just want to bring you in very quickly, Mark. In your case, how clear was it, in your opinion, with the evidence that was presented in court that got you convicted? How obvious was it, or not obvious was it, that you were guilty or not guilty?
Well, it was very lack of obvious due to the fact that most of the facts in this confession, it made no common sense. And like the previous brother who was just speaking spoke, they made it fit the crime. And basically, I didn't have one witness to testify against me, but I was a paper boy, and they recovered a knife off of me. And they claimed that I had stabbed one of the victims in trying to collect a drug debt. And man, it held, regardless of how lack or how strong it was. And in my case, it was very lacking, but they drew the conviction. And when they draw the conviction, it's very difficult to overturn these convictions. And something else that the brother just stated, once you are accused of a crime, it is, man, it's almost downhill from that point on. And, you know, basically individuals like in Chicago, there was Jason Van Dyke who shot someone, a 16-year-old, 16 times. and he was found guilty. And immediately once being found guilty, the FOP raised him on a GoFundMe page over $100,000 this guilty cop has while he's in prison. So I think that is a tragedy of injustice, but the people, it appears, is not catching on. But once they're victimized, then they come running and saying, well, what can we do? That's the purpose of mobilization right now, to try to alert the people as to the seriousness as to what's going on. And it's very, very, very serious. And may I state, in my situation, I was 16 years old when this occurred to me. Only 16 years old. So that means they took away all of my learning years, 44 years old, and then just basically kicked me out of prison. And that's what happens with many of the guys. My good friend, Yusef Shalon, that is one of the Central Park Five. Yusef will tell you, man, what these people do is they mess your life up. And they don't want to have nothing else to do with you. They don't even apologize for their actions. It's just get out and have a happy life. I just think that's so sad. So sad.
Who do you hold accountable and responsible for I know who you hold accountable for your torture, but who do you hold accountable for your conviction and your stolen years in prison?
The entire criminal justice system as a whole. Profit over the people. And that's what it has been. You know, even as we look at Yusef Shalom, we can't forget about Khalif Browder. It's all about profit. If the system sees no profit in you, then they don't want you. But if they see that there's profit, I probably made the system over $1 million while locked up, working in the industry department, selling clothes that was being pipelined to Martha Stewart. So there it is. It's all about profit over the people. And it's very, 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 very difficult to get a conviction overturned once you have been found guilty. And that's why we need criminal justice reform, and we need it to look like us rather than like the system.
You know, this panel, Mark, have been talking about reform for a time, which is why I've put this team together.
Hello?
Hello, are you there?
Hello?
Hello, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, we can hear you. The reason why we've put this team together is to look at reform. We're looking at putting qualified people who are good spokespeople. You're one of them, Mark. Now, one of the things that we're looking at is the Officers' Bill of Rights. What stands out for you that protects officers against prosecution that you believe that the people could unite and try and fight to change, because that's what this program is about today, the fight for change, that will make the judicial system more susceptible to working towards a sincere and true and integral justice process?
Well, let me tell you, the criminal justice system as a whole, it has literally gotten away. And as we have came out with laws to hold police officers accountable, they still wiggle from up under that. We need change in the prosecutors' agencies, offices is what I'm saying. We need where that the people have some type of control over what happens to a police officer, opposed to the police agencies now able to deal with this stuff in secretive, opposed to before the public. We have seen time and time again where that police officers have engaged into criminal activity while they have been given a slap on the wrist. And here it is, maybe someone on this calls maybe have a significant other or a kid that's sitting inside of the prison system serving life for the same offense that police officer was accused of, but we watch the police officer and the police officer gets away with it. So we need change, and we need change now.
Amen. Thank you very much for that contribution. Stay out. Mark, could you just do me one favor? We've still got 45 minutes of this show left. Can you turn your video off and just keep it on audio, because it's interfering with the signal, and what we don't want to do is lose the stream. All right, we're just doing audio.
Okay, I got you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Please stay on the line, because I'm going to bring you back very shortly. But Jerry, do you hear what Mark is saying there?
I do indeed. I can't disagree with it. This system, for me, the biggest thing that needs to occur is we need to have open records. For instance, prosecutors in some states do not have to reveal all the evidence that they have in their files to the defense attorney. They only have to reveal what they intend to use. That's a problem, because that's a Brady violation, first of all, if it's not revealed. Defense can't put on a viable defense if they don't know what evidence is out there. And there's too many circumstances that have been taken to the Supreme Court where evidence was in the file of a prosecutor that would have exonerated the defendant, and they never released it. And that's the first thing. The second thing is, once the police officer's investigation is done, those records need to be personal information that needs to be redacted out of stuff that's, for everybody, their social security numbers, those kinds of. We're not opposed to those kind of redactions. Results and the investigation need to be open once that investigation is concluded. The problem that occurs is that if law enforcement knows that those records are going to be available, they'll never close an investigation. They'll leave it open forever so they don't have to disclose it. And there's got to be some changes there as well. So transparency, in my mind, is a huge step towards accountability. And once the public knows what's going on, we'll see, and the judges cannot hide behind their the lack of transparency, and prosecutors can't be held accountable, hide behind it. We can't hold anybody accountable right now because we don't know who's doing what. Once that comes open to the light of day, a lot of things occur in the darkness, but when it's revealed by the light, changes occur.
D. Martin, when it happens in the light, changes occur. Andre Gladden's murder, execution, killing, was in the light. The homeowner said he was never in fear of Andre Gladden. Andre Gladden never aggressively confronted him, challenged him, or threatened him. He never felt threatened. The one question that I remember asking when we first did that show with you was that, what information was the officer given when he was sent to respond to this particular call that could have possibly contributed to the way that he approached your brother on that day? Are we any clearer as to what that particular scenario might have been?
We are still not clear on that. But what I did find out was actually earlier that morning, there was a 911 call in from Andre, for Andre. My cousin Diamond, whose house he was at, she called the police on him that morning and said that he threatened her with a knife and a bat. The knife and the bat that was found was a carnival cushion bat and a pocket utility knife with the screwdriver Philip had. So the officers arrived, and Andre had already left. Shortly after, another 911 call came in from a surrounding neighbor that said a gentleman was in the bushes with no shirt on. And so the police found him. They didn't take him to jail because he was not a threat. However, he needed help. So Andre got to the hospital via the police. Wow. So the police took him to the hospital, and Andre suffered hypothermia and a mild seizure. And
So that was information that we
there
didn't
was
have in the beginning, wasn't it?
no, it was not. No, it was not. But you bang on a few doors and ring a couple phones, you'll find out some
Yeah.
things.
So
So that
the police took him to the hospital, so they knew he
that's
weren't
what I've
well.
been told. That's what I've been told. So I don't know if this is the same officer or officers. I was still not clear on that. However, they obviously observed him in a certain condition to where they felt as if he needed medical attention. We still don't know whether he was released prematurely or he left on his own. There obviously was no Fonte Gladden, his twin brother, actually got a chance to. I don't know exactly how he got a hold of this particular nurse at Adventist Hospital, but she shared some things and that she was bedside by Andre the whole time, and he was assisted in removing his clothing so he could receive the medical attention that he needed, and that he discovered no weapons on him, anything. He left with minimal of what he went to the hospital with as far as clothing went. Some clothes were left behind, but a weapon of any sort was not discovered on his person. With him entering the hospital, being transported by the police, or leaving the hospital, there was no weapon found on him at all. And the officer, Consider Vasu, said after the shots were fired, Andre fell to his feet, and he considered Andre no longer a threat. So that's why he stepped over him, picked up the knife, because he familiarized himself with it and placed it back in its position, exact position. And moments after that, the witness also grabbed the knife, walked around the house with it, and then also placed it back in its original position. There were not 3 stab wounds on the floor. There was only 1. However, all of the fingerprints belonging to Andre Consider Vasu and Desmond Pascaya all remained on that knife. Now, if the encounter happened the way that they're saying it did, I can't see it happening. It physically wasn't able to be performed by Andre. But given the total situation, they described a man with full vision who performed these functions. The details were gruesome from that grand jury transcript, and it was just it was awful for the family to read that, for my mother to read exactly how it occurred. And mind you, like I said before, for this to be a case of an intruder or someone, burglarizing, the media completely took what Desmond said on other articles to heart, but the original article did not depict Desmond Pascaya describing Andre as he does now. So the story has completely changed over to what it is now, basically stating that Andre welded this weapon and caused this on himself. And his the mental aspect of what was going on further supplied justification as to what the officer conducted at that time. So there's more information that out, but it makes even less sense than what it did before.
Okay, well, this brings us really clearly onto the next point that I want to bring in. And this is going out to Jerry Summers, because Jerry Summers, this is something that you wanted to raise, because all of this conversations that we're having in the last 5 to 10 minutes or so all revolves around transparency. How could we make the judicial system more transparent, that the evidence and information that is collected in particular cases remains clear and transparent from the moment an officer is called to the scene to the time they decide that somebody is ready to be charged?
Well, a couple things. me back up a little bit. When you go from that information, it has to go to the prosecutor and the defense attorney. What's happening is that prosecutors are allowed to decide what evidence they're going to use and what evidence they're not going to use, and then they only disclose the evidence they're going to use, which.
Sorry, we know who that is. I've already messaged TJ. She's dealing with it now. If we can carry on as best as we can.
It makes it possible for appropriate defense to be lobbied. That by not making it and prosecutor's files, he has built-in ability to manipulate the information the jury gets, which leads to wrong conviction. So that all has to open. Ultimately, the courts are going to have to hold account. There are too many officers that perjure themselves on the stand that the prosecutor knows about it and doesn't do anything about it. There are defendants that don't do anything about it because they don't want to deal with the wrath of the system. And then you have judges that allow prosecutors to get away with withholding information. They don't hold them accountable. Less than 2% of any prosecutor that deemed ethical violations and withheld evidence ever get penalized beyond a censure.
Right.
If I were to take evidence and throw a gun down and get caught at that, as an officer, I should be going to jail. If a prosecutor withholds information that leads to somebody's conviction, there should be some consequence for that, and it may very well be jail term. But at very least, it should be disciplined. And the Bar Association's not doing it. The judges aren't doing it. And the defense attorneys, unfortunately, either aren't pushing it or they don't get the information they need.
Hey, Jerry, the politicians are not doing it either.
Correct. And I mean, there's circumstances, for instance, in Tyler's case, officers go into a situation where they knew he was injured, they knew he was in a bathroom, and they go in under the guise of, we got to make sure he's okay, and they wind up killing him. How does that work? I mean, if he's injured and worried that he's a threat, you can go in safely. You don't send a dog in. You don't go in and do those kinds of things. There's a protocol violation. I mean, yes, there's a responsibility to make sure he's okay. The flip side is it doesn't give you the license to go in and kill somebody.
So I do want Scott to come in on the transparency issue, but before you come in, I just want to make a couple of points. First, Scott, I want you to examine what contingencies are in place currently to support the transparency of a clear and precise and accurate account of what takes place from the time a police officer is called to a scene up until the moment that the person is charged or seen to be guilty enough to charge. But before you do that, I wanted to just bring one thing to people's attention. You know, when you call the paramedics, I don't know whether that's the same over there. Well, I think it is the same over there in the States as it is over here. But the person that actually calls, the paramedics are actually online and can hear everything that's taking place right up until the paramedics arrive on the scene and take over the situation, so that everything is transparent. Secondly, I believe that there is already contingencies in place to support the transparency of police arriving right up until the moment they hand over or deposit an individual to the county jail, if that's where they need to go, in America, so to speak, the prison or the prison cells here in the UK. And that's the body cams and etc. But how could we utilize these resources to maintain some form of transparency from the time that, or what should we do? What should be the protocol? Just as a common sense observation, Scott, in order to preserve the integrity of law enforcement and the justice system as a whole? Your thoughts?
First of all, what you're saying is increased communication at the scene,
Absolutely.
which I think is a great idea, because in the case of my son, for example, there were EMTs and paramedics outside the building where he was shot and killed, but and it's on the body-worn cameras of the officers who responded. The EMTs had to interview the shooting officers and others present. Where was he shot? When was he shot? What are we doing? So there was wasted time in my son's case that might have saved him had the EMTs known, as Jerry or somebody said, the details of his shooting. So that's a pure communication problem that could be quickly solved by, some kind of open mic, dispatch like this show. Everybody's listening to what's going on. That should be a no-brainer, but that didn't happen, and it's not happening. Number two, the body-worn cameras. They're used and they're abused. I feel the officers, the moment they get on duty, period, should have their body-worn cameras on during their shift. And then that should be, just uploaded into the cloud and available if there's any issues. That kind of technology is available. Too many agencies are not using body-worn cameras and allowing the officers to turn them off and on. That is a lack of transparency. And
I agree.
The last thing I want to say is what Jerry and everybody else says. To increase transparency, we need civilian oversight panels, civilian oversight committees. My friend Norm Stamper, who wrote the books, Breaking Rank and How to Change America's Law Enforcement, What's Wrong with the System, very famous, well-known writer, retired police chief of Seattle. Norm would tell you that can be done in any community, small or large. Citizen oversight committee. I'm not talking grand jury, because they're selected by the DA and politicians. I'm talking civilian oversight committees with people like Mark Clements on it, people like Patrick on it, people like Dee on it, people like Scott on it, that are going to take a critical look at the actions of the officers to establish what's reasonable or what's unreasonable, and not a political stamp. So transparency can come from several areas, and it is definitely lacking. That's all.
We once mentioned there's a couple of things that I just want to highlight here, and then I'm going to get Jerry to just come in very quickly and give us whether or not we're being outrageous. But as far as the body cams and dash cams are concerned, I totally agree with you, Scott, and I think it's even far simpler than that. We're living in a world of modern technology, Wi-Fi, and everything else. So the ability to have some sort of sender receiver in the police vehicle, that whatever is picked up, because I know these dash cams are small and they can't hold much material for too long, but if everything that was being recorded was immediately being sent to a sender receiver that would be connected to the vehicle, that then has the ability to send to mothership, to mother base, wherever that is, local station, nationally, whatever it is, that then stores that and holds that constantly frees up the space that the officer would need to continue recording for however long he was involved in some sort of altercation or investigation. That would maintain transparency from the moment, as Scott says, either he arrives on duty or he arrives at the scene, or the moment he gets the call. Let me just put it this way. When we see cops, or we see some of these cop-style reality TV programs, there seems to be transparency from the time that they're doing the
Yes.
briefs in the police station, right?
Yes.
Right
They're
up
always
until
on their best behavior with the
Right?
camera. Always on their best behavior.
But there is a way that they are able to keep all of that information intact and available to then release for TV viewers to see what a great job that law enforcement are doing. But what I don't understand is when we have real issues, and then you have officers who are turning off their dash cams or their body cams when they arrive at a scene, or when the scene gets a little bit too hot for their liking, etc. That's where the transparency and the accountability starts to fall apart. And unless they can put something in place that makes it illegal for an officer to turn off his body cam, then officers are going to continue to get away with it. And there can never be any transparency, no matter what you put in place. Because for me, I believe resources are already available for them to maintain some level of transparency. It's just not being used. I don't know what your comments are on that, Jerry.
Well, you're correct in one respect, and in another respect, you're not. The technology is there to record everything you do from day one all the way through. However, there are some privacy issues involved in recording everybody's conversation all the time throughout. The biggest thing that comes to mind right now is if there's a crime to turn off your dash cam, what happens when the officer has to use the restroom or something like that? Do you really want that recorded out in the cloud forever? So there's got to be some provision where it can be turned on and off. There are policies in every department. We had a policy that when I first started, and we were down to cassette tapes at that time. We weren't even digitally, that I had to maintain every cassette tape recording that I had for at least a year. And it was my responsibility to have it logged and maintain it in case somebody wanted to go back. So there are provisions you can do with that. The technology, for instance, in the dash cams, I could be driving and witness and not have my recording going and witness a traffic violation, hit a button, and it would go 3 minutes prior to when I hit that button. So it would have captured the recording. There's technology that will allow for that kind of transparency. It just can't be a blanket, well, they have to be recorded all the time.
No,
I think,
Jerry, I fully agree with you. Let me just interject just for a moment, right? I could fully understand that an officer needs privacy. He might need to go to the toilet. You don't need to film him going into the local bakery to get himself a donut and a coffee. Those things that are totally irrelevant and not. But when you're talking about officers who are at the scene of a potential crime, right, who have switched off their body cams and their dash cams when they are responding to an event or an incident, up until the moment that the individual is either handed over alive or shot dead, right? There has to be questions seriously asked of an officer who would turn off his dash cam in the pursuit of an individual who was potentially committing a crime.
well, not only that, it's a violation of policy, first of all.
But it's happening all the time and they're getting away with it.
It is. And a lot, some of the judges have taken the position that if it's not written down or it's not, or I can't see it, if it's your word against a suspect's word, and there's no recording of it, then they're going to go to the suspect's story and accept that, and not the officers. It's gotten that bad.
So
it used to be.
So let's just shoot right back to the Central Park 5, right? Because
Yes.
it just is so alarming, right? So they've got 5 guys in a police station and they're interviewing them all one by one, right? They've got all of this taped interviews and confessions, and then the prosecution realized that they've got a massive problem. Not one of the individuals on any of their tapes have actually confessed to committing the crime. They all point the finger at the others, right? So they make the decision, right, that they have to separate the trials. Don't try them all as 5, and try and find a combination of the interviews that have taken place to get the right combination of those to go to court. Now, the district attorney and the prosecution were completely aware of the strategy that was used to utilize those fabricated or coerced confessions. And yet, went ahead with it. It was pointed out, and there are times when you think to yourself, and I'm quite sure that the court records would have documented what was being said during the court, so I can't believe for 1 minute that's been dramatized, because it had to be more realistic. But they are aware of these implications, but yet there was still no support for these individuals that were wrongfully convicted. No transparency.
That fault goes directly to the courts. When you have those circumstances, that evidence should have never been allowed. It just shouldn't have been allowed.
You have a journalist who has just recently written an article in the New York Times, who was an actual journalist in 1989, reporting on the rape and the trial and the convictions of the Central Park Five, who says, "I saw the flaws back then and chose to ignore it."
And that's the crux of the entire problem within our judicial system. People see the flaws and they choose to ignore them because
Yes.
not ignoring them are significant to an individual. I mean, I lost my career because I didn't allow a public official to break the law. And it cost me my career. It cost me the majority of my retirement. And it destroyed my credit during that period of time. But I wasn't going to allow that to happen. And that was an ethical issue for me. And even when my fiance at the time, my wife at the time now said, "What's going to happen if you do this?" And I said, "I will lose everything except my integrity." And I chose to keep my integrity. And being a wonderful woman she is, she chose to stand by me.
Jerry, you're an honourable man, which is why we've become so close and we remain friends. And you're a welcome guest and a family member on the Issues Today Roundtable team. And that's quite evident from every conversation that we've ever had and every show that you've been involved with, and even the people that I've introduced you to that you've supported and given advice to. But that same can't be said right across the forces. So unfortunately, we're going to have some things are going to have to be put in place. So those that don't want to stand with integrity are made accountable.
They need to be exposed.
And so how do we? What can we implement? How can we enforce an implementation of the resources that I believe are already available to ensure that transparency is maintained?
Here's a perfect example. An officer's personnel record is never available to the public, even after they've been accused of something and exonerated. My viewpoint is that exemption needs to be removed. In other words, if I'm accused of excessive force and my department clears me of that excessive force, then that investigation after I'm cleared should be made available to the public with proper redactions. But it should be made available to the public so the public has the opportunity to look and see if, one, the department exonerated me or cleared me correctly, and two, whether the administrator of that, the chief of police or the bureau chief or somebody, are making sure that that investigation is fair and impartial. And until
and transparent.
Right. Until we have that, we're going to continue to have this kind of culture of corruption that's allowed and the blue wall of silence that's allowed. That has to be made available. And there's just public officials across the board that are going to argue that their public records shouldn't be made available.
I'm going to bring in Mark Clements in just a second, but before I do that, I want to raise one more similarity that really brings about this transparency question. And the similarity again was between the Cardiff Five and the Central Park Five. So on the Central Park Five, you had these tapes, these recordings, these interviews that was held. When the guys were being interviewed and questioned. And these tapes were questioned and challenged at the very trial. On the Cardiff 5 case here in the UK, the four guys that were all convicted on the confession of the fifth guy, right? And on his confession tape, he had said, and don't forget, they asked the very same question on the Central Park 5. Did he say over and over again that he didn't do it? And the officer on the witness stand said, yes, he did. He said he didn't do it. Right? Over and over again. Before he did say he did do it, which was obviously they forced him, they kept him without food, without sleep, and constantly interrogated him without an appropriate adult and all of that, and breached all of his legal rights. And again, there we come to the qualified immunity, because with the qualified immunity, you cannot tell me that none of those officers knew it was not reasonable for them not to have had an appropriate adult with those underage children while they were questioning them and trying to charge them with murder, right? That's just one thing to hold up in your thought pattern for the time being. But going to the Cardiff 5, the interview tape for Stephen Miller was slightly visited during the trial, but because of the weak defense that he had, wasn't really exposed as such. But on the appeal trial, the complete interview tape, and I forget which particular tape number it was, where the interview took place, and it turned out that they had actually interviewed him for 72 hours without rest or sleep or anything to eat or drink, shoving photographs of a mutilated, his girlfriend, by the way, his girlfriend had been murdered, and had showed the mutilated pictures of her for 72 hours. And over 380 something times he said he did not do it. And the one time, right at the end, where they forced him to say that he did, is the time that they charged him. And you know what his very next comment was after he said that he did do it? His very next comment was, "I didn't do it. I didn't do it." But they held him on the one out of 380 odd times that he said no. If the transparency is to be realistic, then whatever the officers are wearing, the tape recordings that are taking place during the interrogations, etc., the cameras that they have up in the corner of the rooms, all of these things have got to be made accessible to a defense team.
Absolutely.
And that is the lack of protection, because the law states that you're innocent until proven guilty. But on many occasions, as we've witnessed over and over again, people are treated guilty and are forced to try and find a way to prove themselves innocent. Now, I want to bring in Mark Clements, if I can, and just ask him his views and his opinions on what we've just said about the transparency and what could have taken place to have protected you while you spent that time in a police station being tortured. And how many times did you tell them that you didn't commit the crime that they were trying to charge you with before you eventually gave in due to the excessive torture routines that were being used on you?
Probably thousands of times, from the outset to the end. The problem with the criminal justice system is, like the brother said earlier, they make up evidence and go out and coerce particular witnesses to fit their crime. So the bottom line of it is, long as they're doing that type of behavior, they get away with this type of stuff. Transparency. What can we do far as change? This means that we need an independent review board. What does that independent review board, what must it look like? It must look like us. That means regular citizens being voted on to the review board and have an opportunity to sit on this board and have an opportunity to make a decision whether to either fire or to discipline a particular officer in a certain way. And one more question was about the body cam. What I believe that is, when a police officer receives a call, then it should be somewhere in which their body cams is automatically cut on. And if they're altering these body cams, then therefore that police officer should be brought up on charges for altering their body cams.
Absolutely.
Perfect point. Perfect point. Dee, do you want to come in?
No, I totally agree. I totally agree. Obviously, there are some privacy issues, but technology is fascinating now. It's evolved so much. There has to be a way. There definitely has to be a way to make sure that once a call is transferred to the responding officer, there's an automatic way to go ahead and hit the on button, and it should not be turned off, tampered with for any reason.
I just want to bring in Patrick Lane. He's been on the sidelines, quite busy, making a lot of noise in the background, but he's back. He's back, and he's with us again, and he's not actually had much contribution. But hearing what Mark Clemens has just said about the moment that an officer is called out to a scene or has accepted the call to respond to a scene, that the station, the head office, whatever it is, has the ability, access to switch on his cam. How does that sound to you for a level of transparency?
I think it's perfectly reasonable for
yeah, we're losing you, Patrick. We can't hear you.
Yeah, I can't hear. Someone has some background noise going on. It's not coming from here.
Okay, well, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable for every public interaction between cops and citizens to be recorded. The problem is transparency, but we need to be clear that we have a judiciary, we have a police department, and we have prosecutors who work in lockstep with each other. They work together, and very rarely do you see that system break down and work to serve citizens. So I think that's where the change. I think independent review boards is something that we've got to have. But the moment that you start talking about that, you see this system begin to circle the wagons and become resistant to everything that could promote change. So I think we have a system that is, again, it's working as it was designed to work. And I think that, we can talk about social differences as being the placator for all of that. But I really think that what it is money. This is a profit-driven business, and as Mr. Clemens said, which I'm so thankful to have him here with us today. I mean, his story is riveting. As he said, it's about money, and the money that they made off of him. I mean, just in work, not even counting the money that prisons are making off of the incarceration of people. So I think that we have to look at this thing as a whole, that this system is working for government officials and officers and working against citizens.
Jerry Summers.
Let me jump in. First of all, the technology does exist. For instance, if any time an officer turns on his overhead lights, his dash cam comes on. And the very simple solution there is to prevent an override where the officer can turn that dash cam off. It's the same thing with the body cam. It can come on and stay on while they're on that call, and it should. There's no doubt about that. So if you remove the officer's ability to override, and once they clear the scene, dispatch shuts it down, then you resolve that problem right then and there.
I was going to say the same thing, Jerry. Absolutely. You call into the station, you're accepting a call, they can turn it on, you're finished, you're good to go. Yeah, I'm done here now, you can turn it off.
Yeah, so and that's a simple solution that can be done. It is money. It does cost a little more money to do that, but prevent an override. Just prevent the officer from overriding it. That's going to also give you all the conversations that go on when they stick their head in and talk to somebody that's in custody and their recorder's not on. By having that, it prevents a lot of abuses that occur from occurring. And with regard to independent review boards, I'm in favor of that as long as we have some way to balance what the officer's actions are. So if you have an officer on a review board that can say, "Hey, look, these were appropriate actions, and this is why," and make an argument, or at least present that section, then the review board works very well. I mean, in Boise, we had an ombudsman that did that, took the reports and then gave a conclusion. And the first thing the local police wanted to do was get rid of that ombudsman, because any kind of accountability the system objects to.
You know, we're about 6 minutes away from the end, and I'm going to want a closing statement from you all. This has been an absolutely tremendous roundtable. I think we've really managed to cover a lot of ground here today. I'm going to want to speak to Mark Clements afterwards, after the show, for just a couple of minutes. There's something that I need him to do for me because there's a couple of people I need him to introduce me to. And I'm hoping that he's going to take part in the next roundtable, because the next roundtable next month, I want us to be able to move on from here. And if TJ, producer, is taking notes, it's how do we separate the power that the district attorney has over the local sheriff's office in order to bring about prosecutions, etc., and the direction that the prosecution takes. We need to find a way to interject in that power they have, so that law enforcement initially almost not so much governs itself, but is just not governed by the district attorneys. If that makes sense. I mean, that's how you guys operate out in the US. We don't operate that way in the UK. We have what's called the Crown Prosecution Service, and what they do is they take a look at the evidence provided by the police in order to bring about a prosecution, and then they decide whether or not that evidence is sufficient enough to gain a conviction. If not, they'll send it back, and the officers have got to investigate more and bring more clarity and evidence to that case in order for it to go towards a court. There are several other templates that are being used around the world that have a better outcome than the ones that's being used in America at the minute, and I want us to take a look at that in the very next roundtable. And obviously some other things that we're going to discuss off the air, where you guys feel that can add to what we've done here today, because the last comment I'm going to want from each of you, we've got about 4 minutes left, so it's going to be about a minute each if you guys can, is and I know it's very difficult, we're looking about making the difference, and how do we do that? How do we, as a round table, how do we go about trying to make a difference now that we've got an understanding of what it is that we're fighting against? And I'll start with you, Jerry, please.
I'm just going to go ahead and yield my rest of the individual. Well, I've had plenty of opportunity to talk. We've talked about transparency. That's my strongest point. Transparency, and other than that, I'm going to allow everybody else to speak.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerry. We'll speak again very shortly. D. Martin, please. How do we affect change? Okay, D's not responding just yet. Patrick Lane, how do we affect change?
Well, I think what we're doing now is certainly helpful. I look forward to the next roundtable when we move on to possible solutions to a lot of the topics that we brought up. I'm very thankful to have Jerry back with us. He brings a lot to the discussion. So and Mr. Clements and D. Martin, welcome.
Absolutely, we're building a family here, Patrick.
I think absolutely. I think exposure, education, things that we've talked about, and then we've got to get our numbers up, because we know that there's, other than political power, there's very little power that we're going to have to change things. So I'm looking very much forward to this next roundtable, and thank you guys for participating and allowing me to be here.
Okay, just before we go to Mark Clements, Scott Russian.
I concur with everybody. First, I want to say it's an honor to meet Mark Clements, even if it's this way, and I'm proud of him for not letting the system beat him. He is a success, and I'm proud of him. Number two, thank you to Jerry, and sorry to again pick on you, Jerry, but you're a fountain of knowledge, and thank you.
Thank you.
And lastly, I want to say that if everybody could, if you get a chance to watch Do Not Resist, it's now on Prime Video. It's a very frightening story about training officers. Do not resist. Please try to watch it. I'd like everybody's input for the next show. Thank you.
Mark Clements, once again, an absolute honor to have you eventually. I've tried so hard to get you on the show for so long now. I'm so honored that you were able to respond and turn up today. Comments from you, sir.
Well, let me tell you, I think that the only effective way that we're going to change, we must come with a universe plan, because this problem is affecting us universal. That means we need some type of legislation. We need to put people in the right positions and to push that legislation. And I think that we'll make a change, because training is not going to do talking to the police officers is not going to do. Some police officer is still going to break the rules and the regulations, and I think legislation will effectively change with a harsher prison term or fine.
Here, here, here.
Great stuff, Mark. And again, I says, just after the show, I want to speak to you just for a couple of minutes. I just want to close with my producer, TJ. Thank you very much for all the work that you've done in the backgrounds. You've not been much involved in the show, but you've kept the show alive. Final words with you, TJ.
I just want to thank everyone for coming and their input is so knowledgeable. It's I'm honored for each and every one of our panelists. And next Saturday we have Marie Confinco, and with her will be her nephew's father. So we're anxious for that, and we'll see you all then. Thank you, panel, and thank you, Bob.
Okay, well, listen, we've actually completely run out of time. But Mark, if you can stay on the line, give me a minute or so to tie up the show, and I'm going to come straight back to you. All right?
Okay.
We're out of here.
Thanks, guys.
I already did my time. I paid for my crime.